Let's say that you're 12 years old, it's after dark, you're on your way home, walking along. You can either take the long way through some neighborhoods, or you can take a handy shortcut through a cemetery. Which way would you go? Hi, this is Nefer Kefri, your hostess with the ghostess, and you're watching True Tales of the Paranormal. If you like what you see, I ask that you hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell so that you're notified every time I do an upload. I tend to upload Wednesdays at 12 noon Central Standard Time. I thank everyone who has subscribed so far. I appreciate you all so much. And now, on today's True Tale of the Paranormal. Today's True Tale of the Paranormal comes from an experience that my dad had when he was around 11 or 12 years old. Now, as a precursor, you need to understand, my dad grew up in a small mountain village in Michoacan, Mexico. Everyone in the village knew each other, That was, way, way back in the day. I mean, my dad was born in 1936, so this would have been in like 47, 48. So he was on his way home from somewhere, and it was night, and he had the choice to take the long way through some part of the town to his family's ranchette, or to get there real quick and cut through a cemetery. My dad was a fraidy cat, and he thought it was no big deal to cut through the cemetery. So he starts making his way through the cemetery, and he notices in the distance, just outside the chapel, there's a line of figures, and they're all walking into the chapel. And he thinks, well, that's kind of strange. And then he remembers what date it is. It's November 1st. November 1st in Mexico is the holiday known as Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead. And that's the day we honor our departed loved ones and our ancestors. And back in the day when my dad was a kid, the most common thing to do would be to go to Mass on that particular day. So my dad assumed these were a bunch of people, just filing into the church they're going to attend Mass, in memory of their loved ones. And my dad, being curious, thought, I'll go to church too. Why not? I mean, he was a good kid. He was raised a staunch Catholic. So he gets in line behind the last person. And this person turns around and hands them a candle. Every figure is holding a lit candle as they go into the church. So this person turns around, hands my dad a candle. My dad did not think it was weird that, number one, all the figures were cloaked in black. Number two, he couldn't see any of their faces, just black. And number three, when the last person in the procession handed him that lit candle, he didn't see a hand. He just saw the candle. And it was hovering there, and without thinking, he grabbed it real quick, because he was like, later on he would say, I thought maybe it might fall, and set this person's cloak on fire. So he grabbed it real quick, just without thinking. So he follows them into the church. They all go into the church there, and they all sit down in the pews. And they all bow their heads, and they start to pray. And they're praying aloud, and my dad can hear this murmuring throughout the church. But it's the kind of murmur where it sounds like people are talking in the next room, but you can't really make out exactly what they're saying. He said it was that kind of a murmur, and he said they were all saying the same thing, so he assumed it was a prayer, and one day he didn't know. So he respectfully bowed his head with his candle in his hand, and he's, praying whatever it is that he's going to pray. Well, when he lifts his head up, the church is empty. He'd only been bowing his head, he estimates, for probably a minute and a half at most. So his first thought was, where did all the people go? And his second thought was, holy crap, this isn't normal. I'm getting out of here. So he bolts, runs out the door, runs through the rest of the cemetery. Boom, he's in his own little part of the Pueblo, and he runs up to his home, runs inside, yelling and screaming, and his whole family comes. They're like, what happened? What happened? And he starts telling them what happened. And then they look at him, and they said, Roberto, his name was Robert, so Roberto is Spanish for Robert. They said, what are you doing with that in your hand? And he's like, what? And then he remembered the candle, and he looked at it. It was no longer a lit candle. It was a femur. It was the long bone from someone's upper leg, grasped in his hand. And his parents are screaming at him to drop it. And he says, I can't move my fingers. I can't move my hand. So his dad goes up to him and is, prying his fingers away from the edges, that circumference of that bone, and nothing doing. My dad's fingers were not moving. And my mother went, being good Catholics, of course, they had holy water in the house. She gets some holy water. She douses my dad's hand and the bone in the holy water, saying prayers over it. And again, they try to pry my dad's fingers loose from around that leg bone, and they can't do it. And for all intents and purposes, Dad said it really felt like his skin, maybe even his very bones, had fused with that femur in his hand. That had been a lit candle earlier in the evening. So, what do? You call the priest. So the priest comes. And he says a series of prayers over Dad's hand. He's got holy water. He gives Dad the Eucharist. And then they all watched as the bone just began to disintegrate. And it turned to sand, to dust, and it came out of the bottom of my dad's hand and landed in a tiny pile on the floor. Then and only then was my dad able to open his hand. And they all assumed his hand was going to be all scarred. There was nothing. There was no sign that his hand, that his skin had been so adhered to an object that it couldn't be pried loose by two adults, his parents. The skin was fine. And the priest gathered up the dust and said, I'm going to take this to the cemetery and give it a burial. And he turned to my dad. He said, young man, no more cutting through the cemetery at night. I do not recommend it. And my dad's like, yeah, no kidding. I'll never be doing that again. And that is the story of how my dad ran into some sort of procession of spirits in a cemetery and end up with a human femur stuck to his hand. And so if you enjoyed that, I ask that you hit the like button, subscribe, and tell your like-minded friends. I appreciate you all so much. And until next time, this is Neferkefri, your hostess with the ghostess of True Tales of the Paranormal.